You're listening to The Reporters and Reported, a podcast from Cardiff University School of Journalism, Media and Culture. In each episode, brought to you by the MA Journalism students, we'll bring you insights and interviews with key people in the industry. We'll examine the challenges, opportunities and threats facing journalism and get tips about the best way to follow a career in the media. This week it's me, Chloe Seaton.
And me, Karis Gardner, and today we are interviewing Rizwana Hamid, following her excellent lecture about reporting on Muslims and Islam. Rizwana, what is your current, just to sort of introduce yourself, what's your current job title? What work do you do at the Centre for Media Monitoring?
Yeah, so I'm currently the director of the Centre for Media Monitoring, which was set up in 2018, predominantly with the aim of trying to promote more fair, accurate and responsible journalism when it comes to reporting on Muslims and Islam. So as the title says, we monitor the media. We then create an evidence base which we use to engage with all the key stakeholders, including regulators, editors, journalists, etc., to try and see if we can begin a conversation about the issues that we're finding and how we can then implement editorial policies to try and change some of the practices and narratives that we've found are entering mainstream media in order to improve the standards of journalism.
Great. And we've got so many more questions about that coming up. But first of all, I'm sure a lot of people would want to know, you've worked as a director and producer for television for over 30 years. You're responsible for the creation of award-winning films. But our question to you is, what did your initial journey into becoming a journalist look like? And what were your ambitions at the start of your career?
So I started, probably like most of you, while I was still at university. I started freelancing, initially for no money whatsoever. I just tried to find newspapers and magazines that would take my copy and just publish it so I could get my name on there, and the thrill of actually seeing your name for the first time. So I did that initially while I was still a student. And then I went on to do a master's at City University, and I did the international journalism course there. And then straight after that, got onto the news trainee scheme at the BBC, which was an excellent training ground. It's an intense 2-year trainee scheme where you kind of initially start out in a classroom, but then very quickly you get placements in various, places within the BBC. And I cut my teeth in Belfast during the struggles there. And so that was a real deep dive into, a very tough story, but learnt very quickly. And in terms of what I wanted, foreign coverage was always my area of interest because of my own background. I come originally from Pakistan, born and brought up in Tanzania, and have always had an interest in international affairs. So I always wanted to cover foreign stories and produce documentaries, actually, so that even though I started out in news, and I love the reactive nature of news, but I found it quite frustrating very quickly because I felt that actually you're not tackling or giving issues the kind of weight and time and consideration that is needed. And so then moved into current affairs and then kind of religious programming and then ended up in documentaries. But I did do my stint out in the BBC Bureau in South Africa, and that was during the kind of last days of apartheid and then the elections and inauguration of Mandela and things. And, that was a great period to be based there because Africa is kind of my home and my love, and I covered the continent based from there. And that's when Fergal Keane and I went off. It was surreal. We kind of finished being very elated by the inauguration of Mandela, and on the night got a call to say, you've got to head to Rwanda. Another very intense story, but completely the opposite in terms of despondency and kind of horrors that we saw there to cover the genocide. So it was kind of flipping from going from being really kind of happy because of a historic moment to another historic moment, but just on a different scale. So, yeah, interesting times. I loved, despite my kind of presentation, which was highlighting a lot of the problems within the media, it's still an amazing profession, and the BBC was a great place to learn and to work.
Yeah. One of the things that I always admire about international correspondents is their ability to go from one place to another and just be able to interpret the events that are going on and speak to them. And I think that would be really challenging for something like I've never thought of doing that before. So it's interesting that you mentioned and highlighted that there.
Although it's obviously, and there are kind of criticisms around this, and there's a move towards using a lot more people on the ground who are from the countries because they have more knowledge of the place. But in terms of being a foreign correspondent, and I'm behind the scenes, obviously the correspondent's the one on the kind of on the screen itself and who has to present that story. Obviously there is a team behind there, and often you will have studied the area before you kind of delve into it. But you're right, it's quite difficult to switch from one subject to another, but that's partly your role as a journalist, to very quickly absorb facts, speak to as many people around the issue, try and get a sense of it, and then try and report it as accurately as you can.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, really great to hear, especially obviously all of us start our careers. It's great to hear kind of how yours has gone and stuff. And leads quite nicely into sort of, you took on the role as director of the Centre for Media Monitoring in 2018. What were you seeing in the news landscape that time that you thought kind of needed to change, or what sort of prompted you to take on that role? And kind of linked to that, what challenges did you face as a Muslim woman when you were working as a reporter? Like, did that kind of, what impact did that have, if any?
Quite a number of questions.
Sorry, that
in that question.
Being quite a few in one.
Yeah. So in terms of, probably to lead on from how I found it as being a woman working within the BBC and a Muslim, the interesting thing is when I first started out in 1988, being a Muslim per se wasn't as big an issue as it is now. It was pre-9/11. And I think 9/11 was a real turning point in terms of not only being a Muslim in this country, but also in terms of how the media started reporting on Muslims. So when I was there, it was probably more a question of being a person of colour. And in those days, we all referred to ourselves as being black journalists. And we formed, Black Workers Group, where we kind of were tackling a lot of the issues that we find today in terms of misrepresentation, diversity, inclusion, etc. So it's quite disheartening on some levels to see that the same issues that we were talking about then still exist now, even though there have been improvements. So those were the issues, but I think there were things like, and as I mentioned in my presentation, I was working in news when the first Gulf War was occurring, and I did find it very difficult to be a Muslim at that time because Iraq was being attacked, and because I knew there were various perspectives to this story, and also at the time there were very many questions about the reasons for going there, that I was quite a lone voice and found it very difficult to speak into editorial meetings where there was a consensus about what this story is and how it should be reported. So those were the kind of difficulties. And generally about the kind of lack of diversity of perspectives that were being portrayed in the media at the time. I think that's changed a lot now. That's, a lot better. In terms of why I decided to kind of, help set up the centre and go into it, I'd had a bit of a career break just for personal reasons, and I was at a crossroads, and this opportunity came, and they really felt that I had the experience and both the contacts and the experience of having worked in the industry, but also being a Muslim, and then now being able to head something to actually look at some evidence in a forensic way. And so it was a bit of a pull because I love working in television. And for the first few years, I was kind of doing both because I kept making films and trying to do this. And then it became very clear that actually I can't do both. And the reason, like I said at the time of joining it, is because there was growing evidence to show that how Muslims and Islam were being portrayed was actually having a very direct impact on things like hate crime and hostility towards the media, and that the mainstream media was playing into this. And therefore, I felt as a journalist and as someone who's worked in the industry, I really wanted to look into how we can change this and improve it. And that was my reasoning behind going into it.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I think that leads us on to our next question quite well, and I don't think we could do today's episode without mentioning it. what's going on in Palestine and Israel at the moment. Just for our audience, what are your main concerns about how the media are reporting what's going on in Palestine and Israel at the moment? Have you noticed inconsistencies in coverage? I know you mentioned a little bit in the lecture as well, but I just thought we should bring it out in the podcast as well.
I mean, I'll premise the answer by first saying I don't envy any editor or journalist at the time. It's a really difficult story to cover. It's very fast moving, the scale of it, etc. And I know organisations are getting complaints from both sides saying, you know, you're either not kind of reporting the Israeli side very well or you're not incorporating the Palestinians. So it's a difficult time and a difficult position to be in as a news organisation. But having said that, and obviously I'm coming at this from the perspective of the Centre for Media Monitoring, which is looking at Muslims and Islam, and obviously Palestine falls into that. But what we've found from our analysis, and it's very much based on the early days, and the tide is turning now, and I think it's because of the scale of what's happening in Palestine that the reporting is changing now. But initially, the main things that we noticed was that there was a lack of context that was given to what had happened on the 9th of October, and as horrific as it was, and as much as everybody should have condemned what it was, I think we felt that there needed to be some context as to why this happened. It didn't happen in a vacuum, and as the UN Secretary General said a couple of days ago, that whilst you can condemn what happened on the 7th of October, you cannot report it within a vacuum without giving a context to what has happened and actually focusing on, you know, what is primarily a land issue and an occupation in terms of international law that Israel has been occupying, and you know, so there's a history behind. And I know a lot of journalists and editors, even when people were coming on, and Palestinians specifically, and wanting to give that context, they kept very quickly saying, but, you know, we don't want to talk about that, the history at the moment, let's talk about this. And I think that was a bit unfair on Palestinians because they felt that actually this isn't in a vacuum. So that was one thing, lack of context. Language, very clearly we could see there were inconsistencies in the kind of words and language that was being used. So, you know, just like massacre obviously was used for the 7th of October, but I think people have felt that what has happened subsequently in terms of the indiscriminate bombing and the amount of people that have been killed is equally a massacre, but those words have not appeared. There's been less emotive language when it comes to Palestinian casualties from the part of journalists, not necessarily from the part of contributors and people who've been brought on to speak about it, but from journalists and presenters' point of view, words like horrific or brutal or slaughter or massacre haven't been used. And even now, what's happening in Palestine is being framed as a humanitarian crisis, which it is. But actually, it's much more than that. You know, words like massacre or ethnic cleansing or genocide or anything like that, and the scale of it now, I think, merits some words that reflect what's actually happened on the ground without minimising or negating what happened on the 7th of October. So that's another area. Like I mentioned, things like when it comes to reporting Israeli deaths, there'll be an actor who has been mentioned who has killed Israelis, whereas when it comes to Palestinians, they have died, and the actor is kind of left to the end of the sentence. So that, and the BBC was pulled up on that, and they've actually acknowledged that in a report that came out yesterday in terms of editorial guidance. In terms of backstories, like I mentioned, there's a lot more backstories that are given to victims on the Israeli side, whereas Palestinians are often very kind of nameless and faceless and don't have a kind of a human element to it. They're very factual and clinical in terms of the way that the stories are reported. So a number of consistencies, and I think it's not to say that you shouldn't do one or the other, but it's to be consistent. So whichever approach you take, I think this story now merits consistency, given that the scale of horrors on both sides mean that there's been loss of life and an impact on both sides, and therefore some consistency should be there in terms of how you report the story, as difficult as the story is, but to do it in as much of an unbiased way. And obviously, having been trained within the BBC, the whole thing of impartiality, you know, and I know when it comes to newspapers have a position and therefore may not be impartial, but when it comes to broadcasters and especially the BBC, there needs to be a level of consistency and balance in how the stories are. And the other problematic thing, I think, which is to do with kind of a British audience and Muslims here, is the pro-Palestinian marches and how they were portrayed in the media. And very quickly we started seeing, and it was a result of the Home Office's and Suella Braverman's kind of comments about people carrying the Palestinian flag being equated to backing Hamas or being pro-Hamas, whereas the vast majority of protesters were really there to protest against, you know, the impact on Palestinian civilians. And these protests have been going on for decades, and for them to suddenly now be portrayed as being pro-Palestinian, I think, was disingenuous. But a lot of the coverage became, you know, that these are pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, and therefore anti-Semitic. The BBC actually had to retract one of their intros into a package in one of their bulletins that we picked them up on, and they did retract about that. So I think the portrayal of that, the weight being given to anti-Semitism and the lack of it in terms of Islamophobia, and both communities have faced an increase of hate crime. So I think the key word is consistency for me. It's not about you should do this or not do it, but whatever you're doing, you need to be consistent, especially in a very polarized story like this one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like you say, it's not easy talking to a question like this. But also I just wanted to say, I think that you're definitely right in terms of the context piece at the beginning. And I definitely, as just a consumer of the news and speaking to people, feel like that context hasn't been given. And you can see just from the documentaries that are trending on Netflix at the moment, audiences are craving that context, because older documentaries about the conflict are now trending today because people want the context that hasn't been given. And I guess that is difficult for the news as well, because you've got to report what is new, what's happening right now, but it's also in this, it's really important to have the context.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was really interesting. And like you say, I think definitely that consistency and just coverage, and that kind of leads on to the next thing, which is, because obviously reporting on that and kind of the analysis you've done there is part of your work, as you said at the start, kind of that's what you do more generally about in terms of like coverage in the media of Muslims and Islam, and specifically at the Society of Editors conference in March, you said the kind of tropes that now exist in mainstream media, you used to find them a decade ago on far-right platforms. Kind of how and why do you think that these tropes on Muslims, you obviously mentioned 9/11 towards the start, how and why do you think they've become so pervasive in mainstream media in the last sort of decade, 2 decades?
Unfortunately, very mainstream. And that's really, really unfortunate and quite irresponsible. And unfortunately, it has real life impact on people's lives. So it's an area that we're really concerned about. And and it's not to say that across the board this is the case, but there are certain publications and outlets that are particularly bad. And now that we're in that age of channels like Fox News and here now GB News, which are very opinion-based but are also more right-leaning, we're just seeing far more tropes being kind of spoken about as fact, when in fact they are tropes. And it's going to be interesting to see how Ofcom is going to respond to, especially GB News and Talk TV. But apart from those two broadcasters, you know, generally I would say within mainstream media, it's worse in right-leaning newspapers, and print is definitely worse than broadcast, and that's because I think Ofcom is far more stringent in terms of its regulation than IPSO is. But having said that, even within broadcast, I think some of the tropes, and they kind of, it's odd because they're reported as, they're very kind of factual and they appear to the audience as being very benign, but when you have actually analysed them and are on the receiving end of these tropes, you understand how dangerous they are to be mainstream, because if you have people who are credible journalists or commentators who work for establishment newspapers and, you know, broadcast outlets who are speaking about these things as if they're fact, they are given far more credibility than they would be if they were in, you know, the dark corners of the web. But what happens is that the far right pick up on these. They then get amplified on social media, and because they've been said by journalists or mainstream media, there's a tendency to believe that it must be factual. So it's a kind of it's the mainstream media is feeding off the internet and social media, but it's feeding back into it and then being picked up by the far right and then being amplified. So it's really dangerous, and it has become far too mainstream than we would like it to be, and that's part of the thing that we're trying to tackle in terms of just highlighting what these are, giving some background to where these tropes are coming from, and giving counter arguments and evidence to show that these are tropes, they're not factual, and therefore they shouldn't be, you know, reported on as being factual. But it's an uphill struggle, it really is, and for one win that we make, we kind of go back 2 steps, and it's a constant thing. But I think all change takes time, and it's just about constantly maintaining that kind of dialogue, the pressure. But most importantly, I think the reason why we've been so successful is that we have an evidence base. And, you know, it's an evidence based on kind of analysis and monitoring of over 200,000 online articles and broadcast clips, that it's a substantial evidence base. And if we go, because as journalists, we work on the basis of facts. So if I come to you as a journalist and you're an editor and I show you some facts, you're far more likely to engage with me than if I'm just kind of speaking in generalities that, oh, you are reporting on Muslims in this way. So I think the fact that we have this evidence base is making a big difference, and we are being listened to, and, you know, media outlets are engaging with us. Hence, you know, I have been able to speak at an event like, you know, the conference that the Society of Editors held. If we weren't credible, we would not be given that platform. So there are some inroads, but it is an uphill struggle.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You've kind of answered the next question in that one, but just very briefly then, following on from that, do you think that the rise of social media has helped to facilitate and normalise discrimination every day? Unfortunately,
yes. I mean, it really has. And it's interesting that today the online harms bill has become law. And it's to see how it's going to be able to regulate it, because it's so hard to regulate, you know, social media. But at least there is now a law in place, and we have to see how Ofcom is going to handle that. And one of the things, not just the Centre for Media Monitoring, but other organisations that are very interested in holding the media to account on various things, but also media reform, is one of the things that we'd asked for and they'd asked for was for there to be a clause in there that included the media and newspapers, because obviously some of the content from newspapers that appears online is also harmful. But newspapers obviously have an exemption. The comment sections below articles, where a lot of vitriol can be found and a lot of, you know, online harm, that also has an exemption. I think what is classified in the new law in terms of who a publisher is, the criteria and the bar is so low. So if I, you know, for example, was a right-wing organisation or a far-right organisation, I could easily establish a publication, but as long as I have an address, as long as I have some kind of guidelines in terms of policies of, you know, complaints procedures, etc., I can be classified as a publisher. So I think it's good that the law is there, but I think it still hasn't gone far enough in terms of tackling certain issues, but it remains to be seen how. But you know, social media it's the Wild West, it's the jungle, isn't it? But it's a beginning. but unfortunately I think it has led to echo chambers, it's led to a lot of vitriol towards all kinds of communities from all sides. I don't know how you rein it in and control it, because, you know, it's kind of an open space for anything. But this, I think, is a beginning. So let's see, and the platforms need to be held to account. So I think it's a good move.
Yeah. Thank you so much for raising about the exemptions as well. I don't think many people would know about that, the specifics of the law that's coming in and how easy it is to become a publisher, as you say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry, bit of a shift now, but kind of just our final question. Obviously, this podcast is kind of all about people who are looking to get into journalism. You talked about your own story at the start, which was really fascinating. And so finally, kind of what would be your, say, top 3 tips for any of our listeners or us who have journalistic ambitions in the future?
The first, while you're on this course, is absolutely learn everything that you can about the tools of the trade. You know, just make the most. It's such a valuable course that you're doing. And often you can kind of take it for granted. Do not take it for granted, because you're going to learn everything that you need to learn in order to become, you know, a working journalist. So really engage with it fully while you're here. Number 2, I think, really go in terms of the medium that you want to go in, even though it may initially be difficult for you to get into that, but really pursue it. If you're passionate about a particular medium, just keep knocking on doors, keep trying, and persevere. You've really got to be very thick-skinned if you work in the media. You've got to be very committed, you've got to persevere, and you've got to have a slight edge where, you know, you will have to use your elbows at times, you will have to be hard-skinned, but just persevere. If you've got a passion, I think you will. You'll push and push and push and push, and don't be scared to reach out to people. People are very busy, I know, but reach out to people. Initially, whatever job you get, take it. It may not be your ideal job, but take whatever job you can get to get your foot in there, and then work really hard and do whatever story you're given, whatever you're thrown, because everything that you do, you'll learn from it, and it'll be one more thing that you can add to your portfolio, and slowly you can build it up and get to a position where you can actually start picking and choosing, hopefully, where you want to be and how you want to do it. I mean, that's more than 3 tips, but, you know, once you're in there, I think,
you've got.
yeah. And just like I was saying, you know, be bold and stand up for things. I think if you see things that you disagree with, or you think that they're falling in a line which could be harmful to whoever that particular audience is, you know, be brave enough to do that. Treat your subjects in terms of the stories and the people that you go out to interview. Whenever I did, you know, if I did a story, or especially with documentaries, I always put myself in the position of the person that I was going to be making a film about. 1, thinking, how would I like to be treated? 2, would I like to be asked that question? 3, would I like to be put in that position? And 4, if I was appearing in that documentary, would I be happy with how I have been portrayed? So always put yourself in the position of the person that is your subject, and have integrity. I think be principled about it. I don't think the story is worth it if you are exploiting somebody, treading on somebody's feet, or cutting corners, or potentially giving half-truths. I think have integrity, because that'll stand for a lot in life. You've got to form relationships with people. I mean, things have changed now. When I started out, half the time you were on the phone or you were on the ground, building up relationships, building up contacts, so that when you had a story, you could actually call on people and they trusted you, because it wasn't just suddenly out of the blue. I think now a lot of the time people are on their desk, kind of on the internet, but I think place a value and respect the people who are really feeding you what you need as a journalist. And if you do that, I think you'll be fine.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. That was really excellent. That was Rizwana Hamid, and we are Cardiff Gardner
and Chloe Seaton from CGS News.